Hi everybody, Keith Tandy here from Flyin Miata, and today I'm going to be talking about one of the more misunderstood aspects of suspension tuning, and that is spring preload. I'm going to talk about what it is, what you're really doing when you think you're adjusting spring preload, how it affects the car's dynamics, how it affects maybe motorcycle dynamics, and so on. If you have any questions during this video, please throw them in the comments. We will try to answer them live if you are doing this live. If you're watching sometime in the future on YouTube, put them in the comments. We do read every single comment and we will do our best to answer them, not live, in the comments. And of course, always, if you do enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, to like this video, and well, like I said, comment, because the feedback makes it a lot more fun when there's actually feels like there's somebody else on the end of that camera lens. So, spring preload. Those of you who didn't enjoy high school physics are probably not going to enjoy this particular conversation either, because we're going to get into things like spring constants and all the stuff you probably should have been paying attention to. Hopefully you did. If my high school physics teachers are paying attention and watching this, I apologize for maybe playing a little fast and loose with force and load and that sort of thing. I'm trying to get this across. Anyhow. So what is preload? Preload is basically the amount of compression a spring has when it is in its fully extended state like this, when a coilover or a spring shock assembly is fully extended. Very rarely is the spring loose. There's always a little bit of load on there to keep it in place, to keep all the hardware from dropping out. And that is the preload, the amount of basic load that is in there, the amount of force that's being stored up in this setup right now. And that amount of force is effectively the amount that the spring is compressed. If you have, I'm going to get into some numbers in a moment on this one, but let's say you have a spring that is 100 pounds per inch. That means it takes 100 pounds of load to compress it by 1 inch. I'm using very, very easy numbers here. Really, Miata numbers are more complicated than that, but we don't want to talk about 375. The math gets weird. So 100 pounds. So if it's been compressed by 1 inch, there is basically 100 pounds of preload on that spring, because again, it takes 100 pounds to compress it 1 inch. It's been compressed by 1 inch, 100 pounds of load. So what's happening is it's basically exerting a force in the opposite direction. If you have 100 pounds of preload on this spring, you don't on this one, but let's just pretend. That means it's basically pushing these two apart with about 100 pounds of force. So let's just say we have put this on our car. It has 100 pounds of preload. As we settle the weight of the car onto it, the first 100 pounds is basically zeroing out that force that the spring is putting on this setup. So what we're taking is we're taking the net force that's on here, the 100 pounds going up, and then up to 100 pounds basically pushing down until they reach zero. Once they reach zero, any more weight you push on this will overcome that 100 pounds going up and start compressing the spring further. To the point, let's just say we put 200 pounds of load on, or force on the top of this thing. That will give us 2 inches of compression on our spring, because again, 1 inch per 100 pounds. So now we have our spring down to 2 inches of compression, and it's exerting enough pressure to support that 200 pounds of load that's on top there. Increase those numbers as you will for Miatas. They've got, 500-ish, 500 to 600-ish pounds of load when they're sitting at rest, but the numbers all work out the same. Now you'll notice, if you think about that, we have just compressed this spring by 2 inches by putting 200 pounds of load on it. It doesn't matter if we started with a preload or not. What happens, it didn't start to compress any further, but the end result is the same. By the time we've overcome that initial preload force, the amount of compression in the spring, the amount of compression and everything is the same. So that means effectively that once we have overcome that initial force, preload makes no difference. And that's the important thing. That's what a lot of people miss. They think that somehow that 100 pounds of force remains. So you have 200 pounds going down, an extra 100 pounds going up here, which is 300 pounds up, which would be lifting the car. It's not actually how it works. So that's an important thing to remember, is that initial preload, once you have enough force on the suspension to start compressing that spring, once you've overcome the amount of preload that's in there, it doesn't matter. It's basically, it's gone away, it's zeroed out, it's been written out of the equation, it's no longer part of things. And that's where a lot of confusion comes from. So I will point out that I am speaking specifically about sports cars here, because sports cars are expected to have their wheels on the ground at all times, because that's when they get the best grip. We are not talking about motorcycles. We're not talking about rock crawlers, airplanes, I don't know. But motorcycles are probably the place people come across preload the most. We hear a lot from people who have a motorcycling background saying, well, you use adjustable preload to adjust the handling. Well, in a motorcycle, you're unloading one end or the other of the vehicle all the time. They spend a considerable amount of time at full droop, at full extension. And that's because they're just basically so violent in braking acceleration. Their center of gravity is so high, their wheelbase is so short, they have enormous amounts of weight transfer going on. So yes, in the case of a motorcycle, that amount of load it takes to start moving the suspension is a tuning tool. It is an important aspect to setting up something like a motorcycle. Miatas are expected to have their wheels on the ground all the time, so they never go to zero load. They never completely unload a wheel unless things have gone wrong, or they're going all Dukes of Hazzard, which is a rare enough situation that it doesn't really come into our suspension tuning concept. What this means is that if your suspension vendor is talking about the adjustable preload and the shocks, it means they don't really understand car suspension. Take that as an indication that when they talk about adjustable preload, they're missing the fact of what's actually going on. And what is going on? Because you do hear from people saying, hey, I can totally feel the difference. I have adjustable preload on my shocks. I changed the preload. I can totally feel the difference in the way the car rides. It rides better with lower preload or with more preload, whatever. And I did a video on this a while ago, and I hadn't figured out what it was people were reacting to, and I think I've got it now. These are two generic coilovers. They are set up for the same ride height. Ride height is determined basically by the distance from here to here, because the spring will compress the same amount once the car is on it. That is the nature of the spring. It's a fixed rate. It'll compress that same amount. So this spring and this spring are going to compress the same once the car is sitting on them. Again, remember, we zero out that preload once we've gone past that threshold. But as you can see, they are very different. This one is set up with basically the shock body being longer. This one's set up with its minimum length. And there's about an inch of difference in terms of travel here. Now, think of travel, I'm going to think of it relative to the car. Think of the car sitting still and the wheel going up and down. You can also think of it relative to the road. It's easier to think of for this relative to the car. We are interested in bump travel. How far up can the wheel go before it runs out of travel? That's an important one in Miatas, especially early Miatas, because they tend to be quite limited in suspension travel in the rear. But Mazda has always tried to put as much travel in the rear as they can. They were limited in the earlier cars. So if you have a suspension that is particularly limited in travel in the rear, bump travel, you will really feel that in terms of snap oversteer, poor ride quality. You'll find big swings in the car's dynamics as it loads up that rear, as it runs out of travel. And here, as you can see, what's going on there. This one here, with the lower amount of preload, is going to hit the bump stop much sooner than this one. It's got almost a full inch less travel. It's actually even more once it's on the car. So if you're setting this up and you say, oh yes, if I decrease the preload and it feels different, that's because you're probably slamming into the bump stops a lot more often. You also have more droop travel in this case. Droop travel is determined by the overall length of this thing when it's fully extended. So what you're basically doing when you are adjusting the length of the shock is you're trading off droop travel for compression travel. Now this is often pitched as a plus. You can adjust your travel without adjusting your preload or ride height or whatever. But really, there's only one correct length for a shock, and that is, in the case of especially the rear of a Miata, as short as possible. Because you're really limited in droop travel in the back, or in compression travel in the back. If you can't get that compression travel, you're going to spend all your time on the bump stops. You want as much of it as possible. So the correct way to set this up would be basically as short as possible in the back. In the front, you've got a little bit more availability, but generally speaking, you want as much compression travel as possible. We are talking about non-lifted Miatas here. We're talking about Miatas built for, say, street and track performance. They are generally sitting very low. Compression travel, bump travel is at a premium, so you want as much of it as possible. So there's only one correct length. This setup is basically set up wrong. It doesn't set up to it. It has more droop travel, which we can't really use. It has not enough compression travel, which we really need. So yes, you can adjust these, but what you're doing is you're adjusting them wrong. And that's why when you get a properly engineered setup from a company such as Flyin Miata, for example, you'll notice we don't sell two-piece shock setups. And some of our competitors understand this as well. They only sell fixed length shocks, and you can see we've already done that engineering for you. This has already been set to the shortest length you can go and still package the shaft that you need in there. One thing to know about this is because this thing is this little threaded cartridge that sits inside here, and it adjusts, it's not the full length of this particular setup. You're actually limited on shaft travel. This does not have as much overall travel as this one does. You can't really tell, but the limit, you can't see it in here. That's the limit of travel in this one. And then the limit of travel in this guy is up inside. So that is the difference in travel available on this. You know, this one actually has more bump travel simply because of the way it's designed. This was a terrible shock, this one. I got it for free for testing. Undrivable, terrible, but it's good for showing off this sort of thing. At this setup, it did not have enough bump travel. I think it was sitting on the bump stops more or less at rest. So that's an important thing to remember. When you are adjusting preload, you're not really adjusting preload. You're adjusting ride height. You're maybe adjusting travel if you've got one of these two-piece setups, but preload is it's a side effect. It's not the thing you're really adjusting. What you're really doing is you're setting the ride height, you're setting the travel to the maximum possible. The preload is just kind of a side effect. Now, there is a situation where you can get into trouble with preload, and that is if you have too much, way too much. Enough that basically by the time you've got the car sitting on its suspension, there's no suspension compression. That means that you've tried to lift the car up beyond what the springs will let it lift. And when you drop the car on the ground, the suspension doesn't move. You've effectively locked your suspension at full droop. It's not a good setup. I have driven an autocross setup that was set up like that. I think it was adjustable length shocks, and we've seen it also with very high-end adjustable length shocks. People have brought cars in here, it was set up, put them on the lift, you start lifting and the suspension doesn't move. And you might be able to spend $2,500, $3,000 on a suspension, but if it's set up wrong like that, it's not gonna work. So that is the one thing you do have to watch out for. Any intelligently designed setup will not put you in that situation, but I will acknowledge that it is possible to get there. Okay, one question we did have online before this was about coil bind and how preload affects coil bind. Again, it's one of those things where it's not really the preload that is causing or affecting the coil bind, but they do interact in some way. Coil bind is what happens when basically your spring goes solid. It fully compresses so that all the coils are touching each other before you run out of travel in the shock itself. And what that feels like is a hard metal-to-metal hit, a bang, because that's exactly what's happening. Your suspension has just gone solid. Your springs are no longer springs, they are now solid cylinders of steel. It's very hard on the springs. It's very hard on the suspension. It's very hard on the driver. You don't want coil bind. And what happens with coil bind is basically you have the perch too high for the amount of travel available in the spring. The solution for it is basically get a longer spring, because longer springs have a bigger difference between their compressed length, their block height, as they call it, the fully compressed length, the coil bind height, and their free length. So it allows you to bring the perch down more, allows you to get a little bit more room. And ironically, you can also lower the ride height, decrease the preload. You can lower the ride height, that will get you away from coil bind. It's not really related to preload, but you can see that if you get yourself in a situation where you are getting coil bind, you probably have a fair bit of preload in there. But again, they're not really related. They're just two aspects of the same problem, I guess. We also had a question in here about preload on sways. And there is a big difference in sway bars and coil springs when they're on the car, is that the sway bars ideally are not loaded at rest. They're designed to pivot with the suspension. And at rest, when the car is just sitting on its wheels, there shouldn't be any side-to-side load, which is what torques them up and down or twists them basically. So ideally, there should be no preload in sway bars because they are designed to release that. If you have a sway bar that is bent, or if you have a sway bar that has different end links on it, so that basically there is some twist in the bar when the car is just sitting still, that is preload, and that will be trying to force the car over to one side so it can straighten itself out. That's a circle track kind of thing. You can do that for circle track where you know all your turns are going to be left-hand turns. You might want to actually preload the bars so the car really wants to go left. But for sports car stuff where you're turning both directions, basically what you want is you want zero preload on that sway bar. You don't want it torqued at rest, which again is a very different thing. There's no load on the bar when it's just sitting there. There should be no load on the bar, whereas when a car is sitting on its wheels, this one isn't. When a car is sitting on its wheels, there is load, of course. There's about a quarter of the weight of the car sitting on each corner, so they're never really fully unloaded. The way to deal with preload on a sway bar is adjustable end links. You set the end link lengths so that basically the bolts, the attachment point can go in and out easily, that there's no force involved. You don't have to bend the bar to get the end link in. Unless your bar is bent or your car does not sit level, chances are you don't really have any significant preload in your sway bars. Any questions? Yes, we do have a question. Can I use sway bar preload to corner balance my suspension? It's kind of like cheating on your math test. I suppose technically you probably could, but it is the wrong answer because it is going to load the car up in different, like you'll effectively end up with different spring rates at different corners if you do that, because the sway bar is going to want to load one way and unload the other. I wouldn't recommend it. Usually when you're corner weighting, the first thing you do is you disconnect the sway bars so you ensure that they are not messing with your coilover, with your corner weight setup. So I guess technically the answer is yes, but don't. Question. Okay, so the question is about helper springs and what they do in terms of ride height and preload. Now the main purpose of helper springs in most cases, and I've heard sometimes they're called helper springs, what's the other name for them? Tender springs. I've seen them defined as differently, one being basically the rate, and I've seen them defined exactly the opposite. You know, one person will say, well, this is a helper spring is a high rate and a tender spring is a low rate, and vice versa. So I'm just going to call them both secondary springs. So a secondary spring like this one, this is a very low rate. I can actually, you can see I can just compress it with my fingers. It's probably about 5 or 10 pounds. Its main job is to just keep hardware in place. For various packaging reasons, you couldn't use a longer spring in this, whether it's because you couldn't drive the perch down further, or because springs as they get longer have more of a tendency to wobble as they compress, so you don't want to go too long, especially on a smaller diameter one like this. So this is basically, the purpose of this one is just to keep the hardware in place, because there are some adapters, well, not in this one so much. There are often adapters in place on the upper mounts. It keeps the spring from slipping off its perch. So a very lightweight one like this is effectively just there to hold things in place. It means there's very little preload on here, because this is going to be the first thing to compress, and until it goes fully solid, until it reaches its full compression, its block height, it's taking most of the load, because it's going to be the one that compresses the most. The dynamics of two springs are interesting, but the difference between these two are enough that we can basically ignore it. You'll see that this spring does have a flat design. It's not a round coil like these ones are, and that's because it is designed to go into bind, designed to be squashed all the way flat without taking damage all the time. So that's one style. The other style is something like used, oh, it's actually heavy, on the VMAX, and that is again, it's either a helper or a tender, but it's the higher rate. This is about 125 pounds, if I remember correctly. So the idea with this one is, again, you can't necessarily package a full-length, full-rate spring for various reasons. So this one is designed partly to keep everything in place, but also to help extend the shock once you have fully unloaded the main spring. So, for example, you know, you're going over a jump. You're going over the top of the corkscrew. For example, suspension gets very unloaded. The main spring fully unloads, and that's when the secondary spring starts to add another, 100 pounds or so of force to help extend the shock, to help keep the wheel in contact with the ground. It's not as good as having the full spring going on there, but it does help a little bit. And that's generally the purpose. If you actually look at our fixed springs for the Miata, many of them actually have a set of close coils at one end, and that's to offer the same purpose. It's effectively got built-in secondary springs. If you go too big, I've tried this, like a true dual rate spring was 300 and 500, something like this. You get really weird behavior because the suspension is soft until all of a sudden it takes a set. The damping is very hard to get because the secondary spring is active most of the time. Ideally, in a design like this, the secondary spring is fully compressed at ride height, so it doesn't really come into play until you fully extend that big one. So it's still just a secondary. It's not an active spring. It's just there to do that last little, get your feet on the ground. It's like putting your toes down instead of just keeping your foot flat when you're jumping. You're not really putting a lot of pressure on, but you're still in contact with the ground and it feels better. Anything else? No. Okay, and I think I covered everything that was on my notes. So, if you do have any questions about this, please do not be afraid to either give us a call, to contact us through myriad of channels, email, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube comments. We have a little chat thing on our website that actually goes to real people if you ask it to. So we are happy to answer any further questions you might have on this. Putting your questions in the comments means that other people get to see them, and hopefully any answers we give will help them out as well. Plus, we always like seeing comments on the videos. It's more interesting. We'd be happy to help you out if you have questions about how to choose the right suspension for your particular application. We do have a number of very good technical service support staff here who will be happy to work out the best setup for you, because we know that suspension, it's a big investment. It can make a big difference to your car. And it's not always the same answer for everyone, depending on what you're doing. So we'd be happy to help you out. Just reach out to us at Flyin Miata and we'll set you up. In the meantime, my name's Keith Tanner. Thanks for paying attention. Hope you learned something. We'll speak to you soon.